a dowry, a prayer, and a veil. Preparing for the wedding day, the day before, a medieval wedding rarely began with music. It began with silence. The hearth fire in the corner of a one-room cottage would be stirred gently, its embers coaxed into warmth, not for comfort, but for continuity. The fire was never to go out, even on days of change. Above it, a small kettle might hang, releasing faint steam from herbs soaked in water. Dried wormwood or crushed sweet flag gathered the summer before. Outside, the world remained still. The sky, pale and undecided, gave no sign of rain or sun. Work was still done, but in muted gestures. An aunt adjusting a seam, a mother drawing water. No laughter echoed through the house, nor did music. This was not a time for joy in the modern sense. The girl who would soon be a bride was not celebrated with ribbons or flowers. Instead, she sat quietly, her hands still. The bridal chest stood near the sleeping bench. Pine, iron-bound, worn smooth in places where years of small hands had traced its grain. It had been carved when the girl was small. Not for her toys. The contents reflected years of modest preparation. Sewn into the lining of a woolen belt, dried herbs bound in cloth, a spindle, and a length of embroidered linen. These things were not luxurious. They were practical, expected, necessary. This chest said she brought something to her new home. She did not arrive empty-handed. Her value was demonstrated not in gold, but in good fabric and salt. As the day passed, the household grew quieter. Hair was combed and rebraided. A shift, freshly laundered and stiff from drying in the cold air, was laid across a bench. A ribbon dyed with elderberries, until it turned a soft purple-brown, was stitched into the hem of her sleeve. A charm, not for beauty, but for protection. No one discussed affection. Love was not a question. Consent, as it is known today, was not sought. The marriage was agreed upon, arranged, spoken of, and accepted. This was not unusual. It was ordinary, expected, proper. At some point in the late afternoon, a visitor might arrive, a local cleric, his robe damped from walking the roads. He would remove his hood, with a nod, murmur a blessing, and recite the familiar lines that sealed the household's role in the union. The words were old, memorized, repeated so many times they ceased to carry weight. The girl bowed her head, not in reverence, but because, the moment, she was wished fruitfulness, gentleness, patience, and peace. It was not a prayer for her happiness, but for her obedience, and for the household she would soon enter to remain untroubled. As the shadows lengthened across the cottage floor, a thin candle was lit. Not beeswax, and saved for this occasion. Its soft glow flickered against the chest, catching the shine of the iron rings and the dull lustre of polished linen. There would be no feast tonight, no celebration, only a meal of bread, lentils. If available, the bride-to-be would eat little, not from nerves, but because appetite had quietly left her days ago. Before bed, an older woman, often a midwife or widow, might press something into the girl's hand, a ring of iron shaped into a simple circle, a prayer whispered under breath. Instructions not to sleep on her back, not to speak too loudly, not to question what came next. These were not rules. They were habits, worn into generations, spoken with care, but without warmth. The ring was meant to keep her dreams from wandering too far. The room darkened gradually, firelight dimmed, the world narrowed. And then, finally, there was sleep. The sleeping bench had held her since she was a child. The straw-stuffed mattress carried the weight of years worn into its shape. The rushes beneath were newly scattered but dry. She lay beneath a woolen blanket, beside a sister who now turned to the wall. Instead, they let stillness speak. Overhead, wooden beams groaned as the wind pushed gently against the thatch. Beyond the door, the world was dark and unchanged. But inside the house, something shifted quietly. This was the final night of girlhood. The last night spent in this bed, under this roof, with this name. Tomorrow there would be laces and belts and processions and bread. Tomorrow the chest would be carried out, and the girl would follow. Tomorrow her life would belong to a different house, a different name, and a role shaped by centuries of repetition. Tonight, though, she remained here, breathing softly, eyes open in the dark, holding a ring in her palm. The candle burned down slowly, puddling tallow near its base. Then, like all things in that house, it faded into quiet. The morning began before the sun reached the horizon. In most cottages, the stirring of the household did not wait for light. The fire, long since reduced to ash and soft orange embers, a few dry twigs, gently placed, a breath, and the flame returned. Thin smoke curled toward the low-beamed ceiling, marking the beginning of a day. For the girl whose wedding it would be, the sounds were familiar. The scrape of the hearth rake, the soft thud of a wooden spoon against the pot, the creak of the bench beneath her sister's weight. But today the rhythm felt altered. Each noise carried a kind of weight, as if the house itself were aware of the threshold being crossed. She had not slept well. Few did the night before their marriage. The bed was the same. The blankets still carried the faint scent of herbs and wool, and the rushes had been freshly laid. But something about the space had changed. It no longer felt entirely hers. Even in stillness, she sensed the chest by the door. The spindle and linen once tucked beneath her bench were gone, a chapter closing without sound. The women began their work early. Each task had been done before, many times. The shift was lifted from its hook. The seams had been checked the night before. The sleeves were narrow. The bodice tight, meant to show discipline, not vanity. A veil was placed carefully near the hearth, not yet worn. It was not elaborate, no silk, no gold thread. The girl stood still as her mother laced the bodice. The laces pulled the fabric close, shaping the body. There was no mirror. The lines of the dress had been memorized by touch alone. Not decorative, but functional. It would later anchor the small pouch she would wear, one that carried a scrap of cloth soaked in protective oil and a sprig of dried rue. The pouch was not meant to be seen. It was meant to guard. In the corner, the village midwife sat quietly. She would not accompany the procession, but her presence this morning was expected. Her gaze was steady. What needed saying had already been passed down in fragments. She would not interrupt the morning with fear. Her work was to prepare, not to question. The bride ate slowly, without appetite. A crust of bread soft in goat's milk, a few dried berries. It was believed that a bride should never marry on an empty stomach. To do so invited loss. A cup of warm water steeped with chamomile was handed to her by an aunt, who offered no words. The warmth settled in the belly, calming what could not be named aloud. The chest was lifted by two men from the household, her uncle and a neighbour. It was placed carefully at the front of a small cart, the kind usually used for hauling vegetables or firewood. Today it bore linen, tools, and all the weight of a new life. Tied to the cart, strain was a length of rope, worn and fraying, to guide the mule that would pull it. The cart creaked slightly as it shifted on the path. When the time came to leave, the veil was placed over the girl's head. Not drawn tightly, just enough to soften the features. Her hair had been braided the day before in a style past. Tight plaits wrapped around the crown, pinned in place with small iron clasps that would later be removed by someone else. The family gathered without urgency. A father stood near the door, eyes lowered. A mother checked the hem of the dress once more. Siblings stood apart, unsure of their role in the moment. Anon carried a folded cloth, the one meant to cover the bread at the table that evening. It would travel ahead of the bride, along with the chest. Outside, the air was cool and dry. A wind moved through the trees but carried no storm. The road, packed with recent rain, had dried enough to allow easy passage. No one spoke as they stepped onto the path. The procession was not grand, just a line of people, some blood, some bound by friendship or responsibility. A priest walked a short distance ahead. The mule's hooves struck the road in slow rhythm. Villagers paused in their work to glance at the group as it passed. A few smiled politely. Children peered from doorways. No one interrupted. This was a known thing, familiar, even if not frequent. The marriage of a girl was both event and routine. It changed households. It offered little in the way of spectacle, but much in the way of implication. As the church came into view, its stone walls dappled by the rising sun. The building was small, old, and worn smooth by years of weather and ritual. Its door stood open. A figure waited at the threshold. A man dressed in better wool, hands folded, posture formal. He had arrived before the procession. He would not enter first. He would wait. No words were exchanged. The bride stood at the base of the steps, veil shifting gently in the wind. Behind her, the chest rested in the cart, unmoved. A crow called from a nearby tree, and the sound echoed briefly in the open field. The church was colder than the air outside. Stone walls, centuries old, held in the morning chill. The doorway was narrow, requiring a bowed head to enter. Inside, the light was dim. A single window, high and narrow, cast a long sliver of pale gold across the floor. Dust hung in the air, unmoving. There were no decorations, no colored cloth. The space needed no embellishment. Its age, its silence, its sense of repetition gave it the weight of purpose. Every step within felt rehearsed, even by those who had never walked them before. The bride entered first. The veil drifted slightly with each breath. Her steps were steady, guided by knowledge. The priest gestured softly, beckoning the parties forward. His garments were neat, of good wool, dyed dark, with a belt at the waist and a wooden clasp at the shoulder. His boots were worn but polished. He had shaved that morning. His hands remained at his side. The words spoken within the church were few. The priest recited them from memory, his voice low but certain. Latin phrases, peppered with the vernacular so the gathered family might understand, filled the stillness. The union was not legal without witnesses. Those standing behind nodded at the appropriate moments. There was no laughter, no nervous glances. This was not a place for emotion. The bride remained still. At the appointed time, the priest guided their right hands together. The joining was physical, palm to palm, and symbolic. The hands were wrapped in a thin strip of cloth, white, if available, plain. The act was called hand-fasting, and it marked the sealing of intent. In some villages, it was the entire marriage. Rings were not always exchanged. When they were simple bands, rarely made of gold. Iron was more common, and sometimes just a woven braid. In many regions, a gift from the groom's family would be passed, a token, a piece of land. The bride gave no gifts. Her offering was her dowry, her future labor, and her lineage. When the final words were spoken, there was no applause. The cloth was unwound. The hands separated. The couple stood together, but not touching. The priest blessed them again, once for unity, once for fertility, and once for the household. They would now build. The witnesses turned. They stepped toward the door. The air outside waited, but inside the church time lingered. The bride remained a moment longer, eyes not lifted, veil still in place. The moment had passed, but something in her posture. The groom moved first. A glance, not long enough to read, then the steps toward the doorway, toward the cart. The new home, the waiting room, and the bed not yet slept in. The family walked behind, and so the procession turned once more, this time with new meaning. A girl had entered the church. A wife walked out. No music played. No flowers were thrown. Only footsteps marked the passage of the day, and the wind shifted slightly, as if it too understood the change. The road between the church and the groom's home was neither far nor unfamiliar. It curved gently along the edge of the village, through fields now turned to stubble after harvest. Beside fences of woven hazel, past a cluster of trees slowly shedding their leaves. A few birds called overhead, startled by the crunch of steps. The wedding party spoke little as they walked. Words would return later, at the hearth, but for now there was only movement, The mule plodded forward. The chest sat heavy behind it. The groom's house stood at the edge of the village, not grand, but solid. Whitewashed walls dulled with time. A thatched roof, low-slung and uneven. No garlands hung at the entry. No special sign welcomed the new bride. Only a swept threshold and a flicker of smoke from the chimney indicated preparation. Inside, the air was warmer. A fire had been lit hours earlier. A stew simmered slowly over the flames. The smell of onions, dried thyme, and barley hung heavy in the air. Two narrow benches lined the walls, soft with blankets and straw-filled cushions. The room was clean, but not polished. A pair of boots lay near the doorway. A broom leaned in the corner. This was not a ceremonial space. A woman waited near the hearth, older, with grey streaks in her hair, her sleeves. She nodded once, offering no smile, no greeting. She would be the one to teach the girl the rhythm of this house, when to knead the dough, when to sweep the ash, and when to stay silent. Not all mothers-in-law were cruel, but few offered warmth on the first day. The chest was brought inside. Its arrival was not remarked upon. It was placed near the wall. The belt tying it was untied. The lid remained closed. Later, when the guests had returned to their homes and the sky had grown dim, the linens would be laid in a chest by the sleeping bench, the silver comb placed by the wash. The pouch of dried herbs hung discreetly on a nail near the door. Slowly, the girl's belongings would become part of the household, not by display, but by necessity. Bread torn in uneven pieces, the stew ladled into bowls. There were no toasts. The room stayed quiet. The bride ate sparingly. Her shift beneath the gown clung to her back, warmed now from walking. No one spoke of the bed, but all were aware of it. When the bowls were scraped clean and the last coals tucked beneath ash, the room dimmed. Light was measured. The sleeping space in this house was not hidden. Like most homes of the time, it shared its walls with the rest of the room. A narrow wooden platform, raised slightly from the floor, was dressed with woolen blankets and a straw mattress. The girl did not step toward it. She waited, standing still in the shadows. Eventually, others drifted toward their own places. A brother to a corner bench, the older woman to a pallet near the hearth. The fire burned low. The only sounds were the crackle of coals and the shuffle of feet across the rushes. At some point, the groom moved to the bed. He said little. This was not the moment for conversation. It was an act repeated countless times in countless houses, rarely spoken of, even more rarely understood. The bride stepped forward only when gestured to. Her hands trembled slightly as she untied the ribbon. No veil, no witness, no instruction. Only the hush of a house where others pretended to sleep. The girl lay beside a man she had spoken few words to. The bed creaked under their weight. Outside, the wind stirred the leaves again. The night was cool, but the blanket was heavy. The closeness of the room allowed no privacy. But a strange kind of silence settled over the space. Some brides wept softly into the darkness. Some clenched their teeth and waited for sleep. Some closed their eyes and imagined the fire. Fewer still found it on the first night, but all knew that the next day would come, and with it work. By morning, the bride would rise before the sun. She would knead bread, fetch water, tend fire. Her marriage would not be measured by joy, but by repetition, by duty, by the smoothness with which she adjusted to the rhythms of this house. Her thoughts increasingly but for now the night passed slowly. The bed creaked once more, and the girl closed her eyes, not because she was ready to sleep, but because there was nothing else to do. In the medieval countryside, a wedding day was not a private event. It belonged not only to the two being joined, but to the village and the seasons that turned quietly overhead. The sun rose early on such mornings, its light falling gently on roofs still damp with dew, tracing the outlines of stone paths and thatched ridges. Roosters called, not a celebration, but because it was time. Life stirred early, so did expectation. The girl who would be married did not rise alone. She was awakened by the rustle of her mother's apron. Before her eyes had fully adjusted to the dim morning, water had been fetched, bread had been sliced, herbs scattered into hot milk. The room already smelled of lavender and lye soap, signs that a different kind of labor was underway. Marriage, though marked with ceremony, began not in joy, but in preparation. Her hair, already braided the night before, was inspected. The shift she wore had been scrubbed and dried near the fire. Its linen was stiff, fragrant with ash. A belt was fastened just above the waist, plain wool. These knots, stitched by an aunt in silence. Outside, a few neighbors passed along the path, each slowing as they came near the house. Some offered nods, some paused to watch. No one entered. The door of a wedding house remained closed until the moment arrived. The bride stood still as a small silver comb was passed through her hair one last time. Her dress was green, deep in tone, dyed with nettles, and patched beneath the hem where no one would see. It laced up the front, requiring her mother's fingers to pull and tie it tight. Breathing deep required effort. The veil was the last to be placed, not white. That was a color for feast. Her veil was wool, thin, and edged with a simple line of stitching. It did not hide her face completely. That was not its purpose. It softened it, blurred the features slightly, marked her as changed. In one hand she held a cloth pouch, not for show, but for scent. Dried rosemary, a sprig of rue, and lavender were wrapped inside. Their aroma thought to ward off weakness and fear. The pouch would be hidden beneath the folds of her belt. She would not touch it again. When the time came, the door was open. Light spilled in, unexpected and soft. The waiting mule stood before the house, cart already loaded. Her chest rested there, wood worn smooth, its contents known by heart. Behind the chest sat a cloth bundle with loaves of bread, dried apples, and a small pot of salted meat. These would serve as the wedding meal if nothing else was offered. The bride stepped from the house with no fanfare. Her mother followed, then her father, a sister, an uncle. The group was small. Celebrations, when they occurred, would come later. Most relied on ritual alone. The walk to the church was slow. The path uneven in places. The villagers paused their chores, glancing from yards and fields as the procession passed. Some watched in silence. Others whispered. A marriage changed things, shifted land, but all were noticed. At the edge of the village, the church rose from a low hill. Its stones were pale in the morning sun. Moss lined its foundation. Ivy crept along the southern wall. The bell had not yet rung. That sound was reserved for entry. The bride paused at the gate. Then the priest, appearing from behind the threshold. It was time. The party entered the yard, their steps muted by damped grass. The door to the church creaked as it opened. The darkness inside was immediate. Cool air pressed outward. A single taper burned at the front near the altar. The rest of the room remained in shadow. There was no music, no procession of flower-bearers or organ chords. The priest stood beside a narrow table, worn from years of use. On it sat a missal, its pages creased with age. The groom stood nearby. He did not smile. No one expected him. The bride joined him, standing to his left, as tradition required. Her hands remained at her sides. They did not speak. Their words would be offered only when prompted. The priest began. The language, though familiar, held weight. Promises were spoken, not in poetry, but in duty. To honor, to obey, to work, to bear. The bride's voice was quiet but audible. The witnesses stood behind, heads bowed. At the appointed moment, the hands were joined, not clasped. Simply placed together, palm to palm. The priest wrapped a strip of linen around them, binding the gesture. The cloth removed, the hands released. No kiss followed. No applause. A marriage in the medieval world was not a spectacle. It was a transaction, sacred and social, binding in both law and faith. As the final blessing was whispered, the bell rang once. Low, slow, final. The new couple turned toward the door. Their path forward lay back through the village, through fields and fences. The home that awaited would be shared, not built. The life ahead would be shaped not by dreams, but by habit. The taper burned on, and the quiet remained. The morning after the wedding did not bring peace. Sleep was broken not by light, but by sounds. The fire was being rekindled before sunrise, and the smoke, rising slowly, brought the house back to its familiar rhythm. No greetings were spoken, no special words offered. A new day had arrived, and with it, the young bride could not afford to stay in bed. A bed was not a place of rest, but just another stage of the everyday cycle. When she rose, her movements were cautious. Not from pain, but uncertainty. Everything in this house was unfamiliar. The width of the table, the location of the bucket, the angle of the bench. Even the silence was different, not like the quiet in her mother's home. Heavier, more watchful. She dressed in the same clothes she had worn yesterday, clean but not new, already softened by sleep. She splashed her face with cold water from a clay bowl. There was no mirror in the house, only a dull piece of polished metal. Her hair was braided by feel, tight with ribbon. Then she stepped toward the hearth and into her work. No one explained what to do. To explain was to admit someone didn't know. Instead, things were expected. Silently, she saw that the kindling was gone and stepped outside to gather twigs. She saw that the dough hadn't risen and moved it closer to the fire. By watching her mother-in-law's deliberate movements, she began to understand. Breakfast was simple. Bread, milk. There was no conversation. Her husband sat on the bench by the hearth, elbow resting on the table. He didn't look at her, but neither did he turn away. His behavior hadn't changed since the wedding. Steady, worn, calm. He already knew this house, these walls. She was still learning how not to misstep. By mid, a neighbor stood at the door, offering a small bundle of flour. She didn't address the bride directly. She spoke to the mother-in-law instead. "I see there's order in your home." It was a compliment, albeit an indirect one. Smiling would have been out of place. More tasks followed. Slicing dried apples. The chores weren't hard, but they were constant. Without pause, without conversation, and all the while a hum of silence rang in her ears. Yet peace doesn't come. By late afternoon, a rare moment of solitude arrived. The mother-in-law stepped into the yard. Her husband had gone to the stable, and in that breath of stillness, the house was truly quiet. The young wife walked to a chest and opened it. Where yesterday her bridal scarf had rested, there were now other things. A coarse towel, a piece of soap, a bit of bread. Someone had already begun filling her space. She closed the lid without a sound. Then she sat on a low stool by the wall. Her hands rested in her lap, one over the other. She didn't think about tomorrow, not next week, not children, not old age. She just sat, and it was the first moment of stillness since the marriage began. She would place more wood on the fire, fold the clothes, prepare the wash basin, and she would lie down in the same bed beside a man whose name she knew, but whose soul she had not yet heard. This was how married life began, not as a celebration, not as a story, but as a repeating day, and beyond the walls, the evening wind rustled the leaves, as if it too blurred the line between yesterday and today.
The second night came without ceremony. There were no visitors now. The day had unfolded with its quiet rituals and passed without incident. A stew was stirred. The house had its own rhythm, and the young wife, for that is what she was now called, was learning to move within it. Not because she had been taught. Everything in the home was familiar to someone else. The brooms placed by the door, the way the stew pot hung from its iron hook. Every object had a story, but none of those stories were hers. The older woman of the house, her husband's mother, never raised her voice. Her presence was not harsh, but firm. She did not explain, only expected. When a pot was placed too near the fire, when rushes scattered from the doorway, the young wife began to understand. That correction came not in words. The husband spoke little. His time was spent outside, in the fields, or with the animals. When he returned, his boots were dusty, his hands cracked from work. He ate in silence. When he looked at her, there was no hostility, no warmth, only recognition. She was now part of his house. That was all. After supper, she folded the cloths, wiped the bowls, and placed them in their usual places. Her hands ached, not from labor. She was used to work, but from the tension that came from watching herself, from holding back any trace of herself that did not belong to this new place. When the fire was banked, in the corner, the bed waited. The same bed, the same blanket, the same shared pillow. She sat down slowly. She did not expect them to. In the space between breaths, she thought of her mother's house, of the low bench where she used to sit and spin, of the scent of elderflower near the door in spring, of her sister's laughter at the well. None of those things could be brought here. They lived behind her now, as surely as last year's harvest. He did not speak. His breathing slowed. Nor you. The young wife turned to face the wall. There was no ceremony for the second night of marriage, only stillness, only the sound of fire turning to ash, only the weight of a life beginning with no language yet to carry it. Whispers and stains, the silent superstitions of the wedding night. Not all that filled the air on a wedding night was silence. Some of it was belief within the quiet walls of a modest house, between wooden beams darkened by smoke, beneath thatch that whispered in the wind. There were centuries of fears. In the medieval world, purity was not a private matter. It was an idea scene. There was no conversation about it. There was no freedom to refuse it. It began with a cloth, somewhere in the home, often tucked beneath the mattress or laid across the bed, was a piece of linen. Its presence was not ceremonial. It was practical, expected, almost invisible until the morning after. It was there to catch a mark, and not just any mark, but blood, the proof of untouched flesh, the visible sign of virtue. If the cloth remained clean, it became a question. No one would ask aloud. There would be no accusation, but eyes would shift. A mother-in-law's silence would stretch longer. A husband might avert his gaze or look too directly. In some villages, the cloth was shown, hung briefly on a washing line, carried discreetly to a trusted neighbor. It was not about celebration. It was about reassurance. Yet the body did not always follow the rules of belief. A woman might be untouched and still leave no mark. A girl might be pure by every definition and leave only silence. And yet, so fear entered the bed before comfort. To guard against shame, some families prepared a cut finger, a hidden stain, a sprig of herbs pressed beneath the cloth to disguise the smell. There was no open deceit, only quiet defense against a punishment the girl did not deserve. None of this was spoken of during the day, but it lived in glances, in rituals, In the careful way a mother tucked a cloth into a bride's dowry chest without explanation. Beyond the cloth, there were other protections. Herbs were tucked under pillows. Vervain rue, rosemary, not only for scent, but for power. Some were said to keep away ill spirits, others to calm the blood, a few to protect from conception. Circles, crosses, lines of Sam. These too were quiet, smudged by mourning. The church had its own role. Priests warned of lust as a sin. Saints were invoked. Saint Agnes for purity, Saint Margaret for protection in childbirth, though that part would come later. A prayer was sometimes whispered by the bride herself, not taught by priests, but passed from woman to woman. Let my body be mine, until it must be his. Let my blood not betray me. Let my breath remain steady. Let morning come soon. There were women who said such words every night for a year. There were women who never said them at all and wished they had. The fear was not only physical, it was spiritual. The belief that demons sought women newly wed, that sin entered through flesh, left open. That a woman's first night was a crossing, not just into adulthood. In others, none at all. For fear of being watched, no instruction was given to the husband. He was expected to know, and if he did not, or if he did and did not care, the world did not question him. The burden was hers, and so she lay, not only beside a stranger, but beneath generations of expectation. The cloth, the breath, the prayer. This was not a private act. It was a ritual lived in silence. And in the morning, whether stained or not, whether shaken or still, the house would stir, the hearth would burn, and the life that followed would begin as if nothing had happened, and none of it would be spoken. Marriage as burden, blessing, and binding. The church and the wife's body, long before a girl walked toward the altar. Her life had already been written, and in cathedrals far beyond the boundaries of her village, she might never meet a bishop. She might never see a copy of scripture with her own eyes, but the rules set down in echoing chambers would still govern how she bathed. The church taught that marriage was holy, of control. The act of being joined to a man was meant to mirror the union of Christ and his church. Humble, obedient, sanctified through suffering. Love was optional, obedience was not. From pulpits, in damp chapels, friars and priests spoke to congregations who often could not read, but listened all the same, and when they did, they heard that the woman was to be ruled by the man, that she was the lesser vessel, that Eve had brought sin into the world, and every woman carried her shadow. The man was to guide, the woman to yield. Some of these ideas came not from Christ's own words, but from the church. Fathers, they wrote in Latin, but their conclusions were clear. A woman's body was the source of temptation, her sexuality a necessary shame, and yet, paradoxically, she was the gate through which salvation passed. For the church insisted she bear children, and raise them in faith, and never deny her husband his right to her body. This conflict between guilt and duty, between purity and submission, was not explained. It was simply expected to be carried. Girls were warned not to desire their husbands too much. That was lust, but they were also told to submit, even when their husbands did not ask gently. To resist was to risk sin. To consent without desire was to be virtuous. And so they learned to lie still. The word consent, in the modern sense, did not exist in doctrine. A wife gave it once at the altar. After that, her body was not her own. Monks debated these matters in stone halls. They argued how many days a wife must abstain after childbirth. They listed the holy days on which marital acts were forbidden. They debated whether intimacy during Lent was sinful or merely frowned upon, but no one asked how the woman felt. The sacraments were 7. Among them, marriage was the only one not given to the clergy, and so, paradoxically, priests heard confessions, often from women who whispered fears of sin they could not name. They were taught to say penance, not to seek comfort. Shame was not soothed, even virginity, to be untouched, to be touched, even by one's own husband. To bear children was a wife's highest calling, but only within marriage. A woman who remained barren was pitied, sometimes suspected of witchcraft or spiritual failing. She could not win, she could only carry on. Holy women were honored in sermons, martyrs who refused men, saints who suffered their husbands' beatings with silence. Stories of patience, of endurance, of women who bore 10 children and still walked barefoot to Mass. These were the models, not passion, just silent. There were exceptions, of course. In rare cases, love did grow. Some husbands were kind, some women lucky, but luck was not promised, and the Church made no guarantees of happiness, only salvation. It was a faith built on repetition and fear and the quiet surrender of flesh to a greater purpose. A girl's wedding was not her own, it was the sealing of a sacrament, a prayer made in her name, not with her voice. And so, when the priest raised his hand and blessed the union, it was not joy that settled on her shoulders, it was weight. A weight cloaked in incense and scripture. A weight that would be carried in silence. From that day forward, every time she crossed herself before bed, every time she bled, every time she prayed not to quicken, quiet remedies. What wasn't taught in church, there was the church and there was the house. There were sermons and then there were whispers. And somewhere between the two, in kitchens and fields and corners of dark rooms, there was knowledge, women's knowledge, not written in books, not spoken in public, not given from men in robes, but known all the same, deeply, quietly, generationally. In every village, there was at least one older woman who carried this knowledge like bread wrapped in cloth, not flaunted, but folded into everyday life. She was not called a healer, or a midwife, or a wise woman. She might just be Agnes, who knew about herbs, or Lena, who helped with birthing. But if a young bride found herself in need of comfort, of help, of something unspoken, there were herbs for sleep. Valerian, ground poppy, boiled fennel root, crushed and mixed with ale or steeped in goat's milk. There were herbs for cramping. They were not called depression or trauma. There were no such words, but the body remembered. And so did the hands that worked with nettles and rosemary. Then there were the herbs, not openly spoken of, pennyroyal, and never to unmarried girls. These were herbs that cleansed the womb, that brought on late courses, that warned the body away from holding what it was not yet ready to bear. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they did not, but always their use was wrapped in silence. A woman did not ask directly. She might bring a gift, eggs, a bit of cheese, a piece of cloth, and sit by the fire. She might say, "My belly is uneasy," or "I've not felt quite myself," and the older woman would nod and stir something into a cup and say, "Drink this slowly and sleep with your feet warm." Nothing more needed to be said. Protection was not only in potions, it was in practice. Women shared stories, softly, with eyes lowered, about what to eat after wedding night, about how to avoid quickening, about lying on one side afterward to avoid conception, or drinking boiled juniper if a cycle did not return. These were not guarantees, a flicker of choice. Sometimes a young wife would wake before dawn, fetch water herself, and slip something bitter into her morning broth. No one asked why, no one needed to. Knowledge was shared at the edge of other tasks, while spinning wool, while combing flax, while crushing seeds with a mortar. Some women wrote things down in hidden ledgers wrapped in linen, their ink faded, their words coded. Many more simply remembered. A sprig of sage in the bed to keep the womb closed. A clove of garlic worn under the arm to repel spirits. A red ribbon tied at the ankle to prevent dreams that frightened the blood. The church disapproved. Such knowledge was often lumped together with superstition or sin, labeled sorcery when convenient, or heresy when dangerous, but rarely was it punished, unless spoken of openly. As long as it remained quiet, the danger lay in visibility, and so women learned to keep their wisdom close, tucked in aprons, dried above, hearths, hidden in bundles of rushes beneath the bed. Not power in the loud sense, but survival, autonomy, a whispered history of their own. Even when they were told their bodies were not theirs, even when their mouths were expected to stay shut, their hands remembered, and they, too, would pass it on, if not in words, then in gesture, in how the leaves were crushed, in how long the hug lingered at the door. And outside, the fields continued to grow. The rosemary bloomed again. The rue spread its bitter perfume. And women remembered what they were never allowed to know. A life built from silence. The emotional landscape of the married woman. The weeks after a wedding were not marked by celebration. No streamers remained. No congratulations lingered. The union was simply assumed. It was now the ground beneath her feet. There were no more veils. The bed was simply the place she slept. The man beside her, no longer a stranger, but not yet familiar, became part of the routine. She rose, and in the hours between, she learned what could not be taught. The adjustment came not in great leaps, but in slow inches. In the way she reached for the water bucket without needing to ask where it stood. In the way her hands moved over the dough with his family's rhythm. In the way her ears caught the pitch of her mother-in-law's mood without a single word exchanged. Some days were soft, most were not. There were moments of stillness and moments of strain. A burnt stew, a mistake that no one commented on, at least not where anyone saw. Tears, when they came, did not belong to grief. They belonged to confusion, to the effort of being so very careful. Joy, a smile from her husband, a nod from the older woman after a task was done well, a neighbor who asked her advice about something simple, eggs or cloth or weather. Little things, little roots taking hold. She did not name these feelings. There was no language for what she navigated, words like consent, isolation, but she felt them all the same, in the way her body flinched before comfort, in the way her voice softened when she wanted to be heard, in the way her days ran into each other like river stones, smooth from repetition. Some marriages softened, with shared hardships, with children, a kind word, a winter illness nursed together, a hand held without demand. It did not look like love in the way songs described. It looked like knowing who needed which spoon, and who disliked the wind. And some marriages did not soften. Some remained dry, hollow, a partnership in function only, and even that was born because leaving was not an option, because shame clung tighter than cloth, because a woman who walked away became a whisper. And so they stayed, but endurance was not weakness. It was its own kind of strength, one that left no statues, no songs, no saintly titles, only generations, only fields tended, children raised, bread, fires fed. She did not speak of her feelings. They shaped the curve of her mouth when she pressed her lips together too long. They shaped the pace of her breath when she sat in the barn and stared at the chickens, not seeing them at all. Sometimes, at night, she thought of the girl she had been, the walk to the church, the veil, the breath she had held under the weight of her own wedding shift. And sometimes she thought of the woman she had become, and how she had carved a self out of silence. A bed with curtains, marriage and fear in noble houses. The girl stood very still while the maid combed her hair. The comb passed through once, twice. Then again, there were no tangles. The knots had been worked out hours before. Now the strokes were ceremonial, mechanical, slow, not to beautify, but to calm. The room smelled faintly of lavender, of wax, of linen warmed by fire. The girl did not speak. She was young. Her dress was heavier than anything she was used to. Layers of wool beneath layers of embroidered silk, fastened tight with laces she could not reach. She wore shoes for the first time that pinched her toes. A ribbon had been woven into her braid, gold thread glinting softly in the candlelight. She was a nobleman's daughter, and today she would become a wife. Her father was downstairs. That was often the way of it. Mothers disappeared on wedding days, not out of coldness, but because they understood what came next. Life after the wedding night. She rose when the bell rang, not for market, but for matins, the early morning prayer. A servant came to her room before the first bird stirred, laid out the woolen robe, brought warm water in a bronze basin. The room smelled faintly of lavender, of damp stone. She no longer questioned it. The routine was set from her first full day as a wife. Her husband would leave early, sometimes for the hunt, sometimes for court. She would sit by the window. These were not physical labors. There was no churning. Her work was of letters, of needles, of accounts. She oversaw the linen chest, tallied the stores of rye and barley, wrote small notes to her steward, in French or Latin depending on his learning. But even within that quiet power, there were eyes of maids, of chaplains, eyes that watched how she moved, how she sat, how often she bled. The bleeding mattered, it was tracked, softly, silently. If the months passed with no sign of pregnancy, the prayers grew more urgent. Midwives were summoned. Old women came with silver pins and whispered blessings, tucking charms under her mattress. If, after a year, there was still no child, the pressure built. If 3 years passed, her husband might take a mistress, or already had. The noble lady was meant to rule her household, and even then, her rule was shaped like embroidery, controlled, neat, decorative. When she walked the garden paths, when she entered the chapel, when she hosted other ladies, there were rules for everything. A lady must not speak too boldly, must not laugh too loudly, must not walk without a head covering, must not read romances, must not spend too long looking in the mirror. Must not. But within those narrow paths, she carved tiny freedoms. A book hidden beneath the embroidery, a phrase in her ledger that made her steward blush, a letter tucked between pages of scripture, written not to her husband, but to another woman across the hills. Friendship among noble women was rarely spoken of, but it was powerful. Through gifts of cloth, through quiet visits during feasts or baptisms, women shared more than gossip. They shared warning. They shared comfort. They shared secrets. Sometimes, in these letters, were small questions. Have you had word from your cousin yet? Meaning, has your husband returned from war? Meaning, I believe I am with child. I cannot seem to hold anything in my stomach. The words changed, the meaning did not. And when children came, if they came, the joy was not hers alone. A boy meant security. A girl meant quiet congratulations and vague disappointment. Twins caused panic. Stillbirths caused silence. And still, she rose again every day, wrapped herself in wool, and knelt at the chapel altar. Not to thank, not always to hope, sometimes just to be still. There were women who faded under this weight, who grew pale, who whispered less each year, who began to speak in the third person, as if even their voice no longer belonged to them, but others, somehow, remained bright. They learned which words to speak, which priests could be confided in, which cousins could be counted on. They stitched prayers into veils. They memorized legal documents. They taught their daughters not only to kneel, but to calculate. A noble woman's power was never declared, like the veils on her head, the titles added to her name. It was made of silence, but not surrender. And in the stillness of her hall, the signs were subtle at first. A mist bleeding, a heaviness in the chest that was neither grief nor illness. And then came the swelling, first of the belly, then of the ankles, then of everything that had once felt ordinary. There were no doctors for this, not for women. Medicine was a man's domain. A noble woman in early pregnancy was tended by other women, older ones, usually maids, midwives, sometimes a sister-in-law who had already borne her own. They watched her skin, her appetite, the shape of her eyes. They pressed warm cloths to her stomach. They brewed teas, raspberry leaf, not always to heal, but simply to ease the change. There was no question of whether she wanted the child. It had already begun. Her body had decided. With each passing week, no long walks. The cold was dangerous. The heat, too. Rest, they said, but not too much. Eat, but not certain foods. Stay calm. Don't cry. Dante, they were beliefs. If she slept on her left side, the child would be a boy. If she dreamed of rivers, the birth would go well. If a candle flickered during her bath, there were relics brought to her bedside. Bits of bone, of wood, of saints, long dead, but still, somehow, watching. Saint Margaret, in particular, was called upon for safe delivery. Her prayer was stitched into the hem of bed linens, whispered before sleep, traced with fingers against the curve of a rising belly. And still fear lingered, because childbirth was not a certainty. It was a crossing. No one, not even the wealthiest woman in the finest home, was safe from what might happen between breath and silence. One bad turn, one moment of too much blood. Rooms were prepared for the birth in quiet ceremony. The windows were covered. No light must enter. No spirits must see. The door was sealed with chalk crosses, sometimes with herbs hung just above it. Rosemary for remembrance, sage for strength, rue to keep evil away. Only women were allowed inside. The midwife presided like a priestess, her hands steady, her eyes trained by long nights in other houses with other screams. She did not promise safety. She simply worked. The husband waited elsewhere, sometimes pacing, sometimes drinking, sometimes praying with a monk who barely understood the dread behind his words. And she, the mother-to-be, would groan and push and cry out in pain that was not permitted elsewhere in her life. Some women bit their own arms to keep from screaming. Others sang psalms between contractions. A few passed out and never woke again. And then, if the child came and lived, there was no celebration at first, only stillness. The child was rubbed with cloth, sometimes with salt, swaddled tightly. If it cried, it was a blessing. If it was silent, the placenta had to pass. The bleeding had to stop. Only then, if both mother and child survived, was the door opened. Candles were lit. The priest came with water for baptism, quickly, too quickly. For death came fast. For infants, the noblewoman would not leave her bed for weeks. Her chamber remained sealed. It was her lying in. Meals were bland, and through it all, she held the child, or stared at the empty cradle. Some women bore 10, 12, 15 children. Some died after the first. Others lost something deeper, a softness, a brightness, a piece of the self that had lived before the pain. But every noble woman, whether she feared it or not, expected childbirth to shape her life, because it did. And outside, beyond the thick stone walls, life continued as always. Fields were sown, bells were rung, letters were sent, and in the dim hush of the upper chamber, Another woman waited, breath shallow, heart unspoken. Nor you. There is a kind of legacy that does not appear in chronicles. It is not loud, it is not glorious. It does not ride into battle or speak before kings. It lingers in a faded tapestry, in a recipe tucked into the back of a prayer book, barely legible, but still followed by the cook. 3 generations later, in the name of a daughter. Many noble women died without monuments. Their husbands were remembered, their battles, their treaties, their deaths in sieges or hunts. But the women, a loyal maid, a steward who had served under Lady Margaret, remembered how she ordered the flour distributed when the village starved. A priest kept her letters long after her death, unsure why. Sometimes a second wife found these things and burned them. Sometimes she kept them. Sometimes she simply wept. In noble houses, the passage of women was marked in textiles. Wall hangings she commissioned, gowns passed 2 daughters. A special stitch in a child's christening cloth. She left her mark, not in paint or marble. In winter, when the fires burned low, servants would whisper stories about the previous lady. Not always flattering, she once saved a girl from being whipped. She had a way of calming the Lord with just one look. She never spoke above a whisper, even in death. Women were expected to be quiet. Their tombs were placed beneath stone arches. Their effigies were simple. Hands folded in prayer, eyes closed, rarely a sword. And if one looked closely, a few left behind letters. Instructions to their sons, prayers written in their own hands. And in these lines, the modern reader sees a flash of thought, of feeling, of presence. One wrote, "If I die before the child is born, let her be called Anne. Let her be told I sang to her." Another, "I leave the silver comb to Alice. She was kind to me." Another still, "Bury me in the green dress. I wish to feel the spring." And yet they were. By the servants who spoke of them long after the Lord remarried, by the priests who murmured their names at dusk, even if only out of habit, by the silence they left behind. In every generation there were women who were more than what was expected of them, who learned to read when they were not taught, who listened when men thought they weren't there, who watched and remembered and wove their lives into the walls around them. They were not saints, nor queens, nor witches, just women, quiet, enduring, ordinary, and still here, in memory, in cloth, in story. There were women who never lay in the wedding bed, not because they were spared, but because they slipped through the narrow gaps left by the world, between death, rejection, piety, and silence. Some were too young when they were promised, and too old by the time their father found a match. Others were engaged, and then the man died, or the land changed hands, or her dowry was suddenly not enough. Some simply refused, not loudly, but with soft persistence, like water that finds its own path down stone. And others were taken in by the church. The church offered beds with no men, meals that came not through marriage, a life sealed behind walls of prayer and candlelight. For some women, it was the only way to live without being touched. The fear of marriage was not spoken of. but it was lived. They saw what happened to sisters, cousins, aunts. How the girl who laughed in the orchard walked slower after her wedding. How her shoulders curled inward. They heard things. A scream behind a closed door. A midwife whispering of bruises. A priest refusing to look a girl in the eye during confession. So they found another way. To enter a convent was not always pious. Sometimes it was a father's way of hiding a daughter he couldn't marry off. Sometimes it was a woman's way of hiding herself. In the stillness of stone cloisters there was peace. Cold, yes. Silent, often. But free of the smell of ale and sweat and demand. The bed in a nunnery was narrow, straw-filled. No one climbed into it after midnight. No one claimed her body. In the refectory, she ate with other women. In the chapel, she sang. She pulled wool with steady fingers. She learned to read the sky for weather, to wait for the moon to shift. But it was not marriage. Elsewhere, some women found freedom not in the church, but in widowhood. It was a bitter road. First came the night of wedding, then years of childbearing, grief, duty, and then, at last, the man died, and something strange happened. She remained. The fields, once worked for him, now provided for her table. The decisions, once his alone, began to fall to her, slowly, reluctantly, and then more easily. There were no more wedding nights. She grew older, wiser, and oddly freer. Might still call her a name meant to sting, but she sat on the porch with tea made from her own mint. She watched the sun rise, alone, and felt no fear. And then there were those women who had neither the church nor a husband, only themselves, unmarried, uninvited, untouched. For some, it was cause for suspicion. What girl speaks to boldly? Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Or perhaps falling asleep somewhere between the wedding bed and the convent door. That's perfectly fine. That's what this space is for. We've spent time with women whose voices rarely echo through the grand halls of history. Women who entered marriage, not with joy, but with trembling hands. Women who survived the night, sat beside them in the hush of childbirth, walked softly behind them through candlelit corridors and winter mornings. We did not rush. We did not judge. We simply stayed. And if something here touched you, gently, quietly, without even knowing why, let it remain with you, not as a weight, but as a kind of understanding and a kind of peace. History isn't just kings and wars, it's the tightness of a bodice. The hush in a shared room. And now, maybe, it's time for you to rest too. No one will call, no one will ask. Let the night hold you. Let sleep come gently. You are remembered.